Okay. So joining us tonight for a presentation is Nancy Patch, Franklin and Grand Isle County Forester with the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. Nancy joined the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation back in 2007. Prior to becoming a county forester, she was a consulting forester. And in addition to her county forester work, I wanted to mention she's been involved in some really interesting regional efforts, to name a few: the Cold Hollow to Canada, a regional conservation partnership, as well as the Two Counties, One Forest Board. Really interesting and exciting regional efforts to help raise the awareness of Vermont's forested resources all the way up through Canada, as well as she's a board member of the Forest Guild and sits on the policy committee. So we're really fortunate to have Nancy join us this evening, and she's going to be giving a presentation on forest ecology. So with that, Nancy, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to you. So if you want to go ahead and just accept the request to show your screen, you should be off and away.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate. Thank you for having me talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, forest ecology. I've got a lot to cover tonight. We'll see what we can get through it all, and be happy to answer any questions or comments that come through from the audience. I did get assistance with this. I just want to make note that Michael Snyder, a few years ago, shared some of his information with me that enabled me to put this together. So here we go. First of all, ecology, you know, it's just this, it's the study of how things work together. It's a reciprocal relationship between organisms and their environment. So it's the species and the site in which they live. And the first part is like looking at the big picture. We're going to be talking tonight about the kind of organisms and the ecosystems and the ecology of the forest within a particular ecoregion, which is the northern forest. And you're looking at this screen right now that shows you that the northern forest is located all the way from the Tug Hill Plateau west of the Adirondacks all the way through 4 states, including Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and New York, and as well as in Canada into Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, all the way out to the tip of Cape Breton. So this is a forest that is considered an ecoregion because the climate and topography and species composition is the same across this forest. The really cool thing about this particular forest is, I got to say, is it is the most intact broadleaf temperate forest in the world. That is a really big deal. So that's kind of what we're talking about tonight. And we're going to take another look at this same forest, the same ecoregion, just pointing out that it's important that it's known as the most intact forest currently, but it's also incredibly at risk because of development and the human footprint. And through this work that we've done with Two Countries, One Forest, and other organizations like Staying Connected Initiative, we've identified 5 priority linkages that is really important to maintain to keep this ecosystem and the ecology for our species intact. And you can see those in the white circles. And as you can look in Vermont, we have 2 priority linkages that if these linkages are broken or disturbed or no longer function, then we have basically cut in half the forest, the entire forest ecoregion in the northern forest. So this is an opportunity that we have to make sure that we can protect our ecosystems, but it's also a great responsibility. I wanted to start the talk out with this just to set this up. We're talking about forest ecology, which is often site related, and that's the kind of detail that I'm going to be getting into tonight. But we really still need to think about this in a wider, larger global context. It just gives it the more importance and the understanding that the ecology of our forests really matter. Just getting into what we're talking about when we're talking about the forest types and what we have out here in the northern forest. If we use the Society of American Forest cover types of the US and Canada, we basically have 7 different types of spruce fir types. We have 5 different kind of pine and hemlock types, 5 different types of northern hardwoods, and then other types as well. And that's kind of a very, very broad description of forest communities across our northern forest. And this is to bring it back into a little bit into what Vermont looks like. So if we can look at that graph and really seeing that the matrix forest in Vermont is a maple beech birch forest. We are a northern hardwood type state. We of course also have component of white pine and red pine, spruce fir. We have a smaller component of oak pine that may be changing over time as climate change affects us more and more. It's same with the oak and hickory types. They are more winners in a changing climate in Vermont. That doesn't just say we are ever going to be losing in any foreseeable future our matrix forest. That is going to remain our forest. And then we get into the early successional type forest, the aspen birch. And keeping a component of that on the landscape is critically important as well. So that's a quick snapshot of really what we have for forest types in Vermont. We and as managers of our forests, we tend to use, instead of more and more, we're using the state natural heritage classification system of natural communities rather than the Society of American Forest cover types, because these natural communities really encompass all of the plants and animals and not focus simply on the tree species. But if we want to break that down, they do match somewhat. In our upland forest, we do have, you can see a number of different kinds of spruce fir, northern hardwood types, northern hardwood, oak, pine, hardwood. And then we have wetland forests as well. And those wetland forests are critically important for water quality and species diversity. There's a lot of rare plants in these places. And if you want to quote Henry David Thoreau, he would call these wetland forests the sanctum sanctorum, the holiest of holies. So these are places that are really important for our landscapes. I'm going to quickly come through a few of these. The floodplain forests, those are important to control flooding. They soak up nutrients as the water in the rivers and streams flood the floodplain forest. The nutrients are then metabolized by the plants that are in these forests, and so they soak up all of sometimes the pollutants they'll soak up, and they'll soak up nutrients like phosphorus. So if we have a healthy, intact floodplain forest, we are going to help mitigate the phosphorus load that goes toward Lake Champlain. So we need to keep our forests healthy. There's also really cool things that grow there that don't grow anywhere else, like the green dragon or Goldie's wood fern. Green dragon is a type of a plant that is similar to Jack in the Pulpit. But it's a very unique and rare plant. These forests are usually found just along rivers and sometimes along the lake where there's a lakeside floodplain forest. Hardwood swamps, another really important type of community. These areas are typically always saturated and have a high level of high water table, deep organic soils. Red maple is the component of all of these swamps, and mainly they're very rare. They're rare or uncommon on our landscape. So when they're rare or uncommon, we need to pay attention to them and treat them with care. Lots of, again, rare plants. If the community itself is rare, then the plants that grow in them, there's going to be very rare plants, as well as rare animals like the four-toed salamander, tiny little salamander with great big feet. So they're fun to find. Softwood swamps, cedar swamps are our best example of these, and they're very difficult to manage and regenerate, so we really want to pay attention to how we treat these kinds of these types of forested swamps. They can be harvested. We have harvested them, but they have to be done with care. We don't know a lot about them as well. So our hemlock swamps, we don't really know enough about them. Again, rare plants. So thinking of these swamps, taking care of them, being careful in how we manage them, or not managing them at all in an active way. Seeps, again, these are the start places for our water quality. If we have a seep, it's often, you think of these places as where springs, where old farmhouses would have built a spring. It's in one of these seeps. And these are the source waters where the water comes out of the ground, has been purified by filtering, and then is going to flow into our rivers and streams. Vernal pools, very important type of natural community that we have in Vermont and across the northern forest. These are areas that stay wet only part of the year, or at most will dry up once every 2 years. Certain types of animals are found in these little pools in the middle of the woods. Wood frogs and spotted salamanders are two of the dominant species that you're going to find in a vernal pool. When the vernal pool doesn't have water in it, though, it's hard to tell what it is. So it's important to start paying attention to the canopy, what it looks like on the ground, what the leaf litter looks like, and you can start picking out what these vernal pools look like. It's very important to maintain these across our landscape because these animals that live in them really don't travel very far. So when they're under stress, they need to find another pool where they can continue their population. So maintaining these across the landscape are really important for the creatures that live in our forest. So what I'm going to talk, I just wanted to talk, those last few slides were really kind of talking somewhat about some specialized natural communities that we want to pay attention to in terms of of our forest ecology, because they are parts of the whole that if we lose them, we lose a great deal of what we have in our forest. I'm also going to now start moving into a little bit about what the ecology is, what species requirements are, and what the site provides, and what site is. So looking at this particular slide, you can see that we have a vast forest in parts of Vermont. We want to make sure that these large blocks of forest are kept intact and that they are connected to each other so we don't lose that movement of species, both wildlife and plant, as things change. Okay, moving on. I want to talk a bit about what the forest can look like in your own backyard. Even-aged forests are trees that have all started about the same time, and a perfect example of this is a plantation forest, is what you're looking at in the photograph right there. They're even-aged the same time. This is a natural forest that started at the same time. All the trees are basically the same age, and this is an example of an agricultural field that was abandoned and then was taken over by trees. The thing about Vermont, which is interesting, is that even though they may be the same age, they don't always grow at the same rates. Different tree species grow at different rates. So a red oak tree will grow much faster than a sugar maple tree. An aspen tree will grow faster than either of those. And a hemlock tree grows very, very slowly. So you may have trees of the same age but being very different sizes. So you can't always tell that it's an even age stand just because of the diameter. In a mixed species stand, it may feel like it's an uneven age stand because you have a great stratification of canopy layers and size classes. Now let's quickly take a look at the uneven age stand. Now this is what a forest would look like. An uneven aged forest is something that would be what our forests looked like pre-colonial. You know, before Europeans came to North America and started colonizing areas, that we would have had an uneven aged forest where there would have been many disturbances over a long period of time. So trees regenerating over long periods of time, creating the mixture of young trees, middle-aged trees, and older trees. So you have a representation of all age classes. And really, when we think about management, at least, we have at least 3 distinct age classes. But in a natural forest that hasn't had a lot of disturbance, you would have 6, 7, 8, or more different age classes as the forest matures and disturbances occur. The really important part of this is, particularly if we manage these forests as an uneven age condition, we have different layers of the canopy, and they often will be representing different age classes. And we want, if we're managing these forests, we want all of those canopy layers to be healthy and able to grow. And of course, some trees do grow better than others. Other parts of the forest that we want to that need to be maintained and kept in the forest is critically important is the vertical structure. We have all sorts of layers that aren't living layers. We have and we have plants that aren't trees. So we have herbaceous plants and shrubs within the canopy, the lower level canopy. We also have the canopy that's understory, a midstory, overstory. So we have all of these layers. So if you look at the forest floor, the herbaceous layer and the shrub layer would be in the understory. Younger trees or some shrubs like striped maple and hardac. Those would be sort of in the mid-story, and then the mature overstory trees that are trees that have reached a level where their full canopy is at the top of the forest. We also want to, that's the vertical structure. We also want to think about horizontal structure, and that means that there are openings. There are small gaps. There's areas that have never been treated or harvested, and so they're maintained as sort of skips. We have a variable composition, so it's not, unless you're in a plantation in Vermont, you're not going to have a forest of only one species. You're going to have a forest of multiple species. So that composition across the horizontal part of the way that you look at the forest is going to be variable, and as well as the density. In some areas, you're going to have trees growing really tightly together, and others will be farther apart. Very important that we have standing dead and dying trees in our forest. Those are areas for a food source. Invertebrates will be feeding on those trees. Fungus is growing on those trees. These are areas that other animals, other organisms need to grow. We, as Aldo Leopold would say, keep every cog in the wheel. It's really important that we keep all of these organisms in our forest because they hold roles that we don't always even know about. We are still learning so much about our forest ecosystems that we need to maintain that it's all there. Down trees are great places for soil. It's where our soil will be coming from. And there are also places for resting sites, nesting sites, and display sites for all sorts of wildlife. We think of down dead trees as coarse woody material and fine woody material. The coarse woody material is the trunk, the bole, the stem. That's all sorts of names for the part of the tree that's growing up without the branches. And the fine woody material is the crown, or the place where the branches are kept. Now, these are just some pictures of what this structural diversity looks like. And we can see the vertical structure in that upper left-hand picture that shows a gap in the forest with all of this wonderful young regeneration. This is the young component of the forest. And that's there because if you look down below that picture, there is a gap in the canopy. So that gap in the canopy, for whatever reason it caused it, could have been a tree that was cut for harvesting, or could have been a tree that blew over. It could have been a tree that simply died due to old age. So this is what the forest will do naturally to create. These gaps will allow forests to have that younger component coming in. So looking at a multiple age forest, you can see that this particular on the upper right hand side, this is a forest that has had series of different kinds of disturbances. So you have all sorts of different layers. And then looking at the coarse woody material and snags at the bottom, these are some of the things that I find the most beautiful in the woods because they hold so many different organisms. And we don't have as much in our forest now as we would have had, again, pre-colonial, before we started managing our woods. So what is it about the forest, and how do we get a tree, and what is it in its environment? And this is a picture that I find really fascinating because you have in the hand on the upper left side is a seed. It's a seed of a sequoia tree. It's a tiny little seed, and then there's tiny regeneration. But look what it becomes. It's like a miracle that you can go from a seed to a tree as enormous as the tree that Michael Snyder is standing next to. Pretty cool. How does a tree grow? So it's a complex integration of physical and biological elements. You know, it is a complex thing. One of my mentors once said, you know, forestry isn't rocket science. It's a whole lot harder. There are things that we don't really understand about how our organisms grow. But we do know some things. We need to pay attention to what we're looking at. So looking at the physical factors of climate and soil and the biological factors of plants, animals, fungus, microbes, all of these things are working together in very, very complex ways. What we do as foresters is we look at Silvics. Silvics is the study of the life history of a tree. And it helps us to predict how a tree is going to respond to its environment. So when we are looking at a forest and we understand how a tree grows, how it responds to the environment, what it's going to do when we manipulate that forest through forest management, we will have a good idea of how to manage, how to go forward, and what we're going to get. As I said just a minute ago, it's the study of the life history of the tree. And what does it include? It includes things like the soil, light, moisture, nutrients, flowering and seed production, the position on the landscape, the topographic position, reaction to competition, growth rates, and susceptibility to disease and insects. All of these things are interacting together at the same time to determine why a tree is where it is and how well it's doing. What does it mean? Some species have deep root systems and cannot tolerate shallow soils, while others have shallow roots and can tolerate a much wider range of soils. A good example of that is bur oak versus red oak. Bur oak has a deep taproot, very unusual for our trees in Vermont, so you're going to need to find that in a place where the soil is deep. And you'll find that in places in the Lake Champlain Basin, on the clay plain soils where bur oak is very dominant. Red maple, on the other hand, can just about grow anywhere, and it can grow where it doesn't need a deep soil. Some species need more sunlight than others, and this is a good example is aspen versus sugar maple. Aspen needs direct light where sugar maple can be in the shade. White pine needs intermediate light conditions, where eastern hemlock is the most shade tolerant, can live in intense shade in our forest. And then we have things like that some can tolerate saturated wet conditions while others need extremely dry conditions. And even though we don't have bald cypress around here or shortleaf pine, that's a good example. And it's the same thing with water tupelo and blackjack oak. We, again, don't have soils, don't have those trees here, but if we wanted to use a tree for Vermont, we could talk about silver maple, handling saturated conditions really well, while more dry soils, our oaks are often needing more dry soils. So a little bit more. Species flower earlier than others. Red maple flowers earlier than black cherry. Some can handle cold better than others, and balsam fir can actually handle cold better than red spruce. Then others have higher nutrient demands, and a good example would be white ash versus American beech. White ash can only grow where it's a rich site with lots of calcium, magnesium, good nutrients, whereas beech can grow in a very nutrient poor soil. And this is a crazy slide, but this really helps us take a look at different kinds of species and what they need to grow. So we're looking at shade tolerance, which means can the tree grow in the shade? You know, how fast does it grow? How old does it grow? It's very interesting to see that hemlock grows its biological lifespan is greater than 400 years. Sugar maple's lifespan is 200 to 300 years, while its relative red maple is half that age. These things make a difference when you're managing a forest and what you expect to grow. So while this slide is not one that we're going to spend a lot of time on, it's just an example of all the different things that we can think about when we're thinking about Silvics. So I would like to talk quickly about shade tolerance, because shade tolerance is so critical when we're talking about which trees we're going to grow where and how we're going to get a forest to respond. The extremely intolerant to shade species, that means they need full sunlight to germinate and to grow, are the aspens, gray birch, willows. Those trees cannot thrive or grow in the understory. Other species like paper birch, butternut hickory, pitch pine, they can get a little bit of shade, but they really still need full sunlight in order to grow. So they can germinate and stay in the understory a little bit, but in order to really thrive, they need full sunlight. Intermediate species like the oaks, the ashes, red maple, yellow birch, again, are somewhat shade tolerant. They can be in the understory, but if you want to see them grow fast, they need to be released from shade and grow in the sunlight. Other species that are more tolerant include silver maple, northern white cedar, and our most tolerant, extremely tolerant, really can grow in the shade are beech, sugar maple, hardhack, hemlock, and balsam fir. And if you were to think about what our forest looked like 300 or 400 years ago, it would have been made mostly up of beech and hemlock, with in the richer areas with the rich soils more sugar maple. So those are the species that were dominant in a late successional forest. But in an old forest, you're also going to get lots of gaps and lots of disturbance, which allows for those aspens to be part of our composition. So all of these species remain part of the composition of our forest depending on what we have done or what nature has done to the forest. You can find out about any one of these trees online through the Silvics of North America. You can just Google that, and you can find out the requirements of any of these species. So looking at site, you want to think about what the site is. The site is the location. Think of it as a tree habitat. It's the sum total of all the physical factors that influences tree growth. Site conditions, soil is important. It anchors the tree to the earth. And this is where the nutrients come from, and water that is stored and used by the tree. The climate, temperature is affected by latitude, elevation, and aspect. And so these things are critically, soil and climate are very important to what kind of tree is going to grow where. Also, we have our physical site conditions, bedrock and the surface deposit, which includes soils, and the hydrology, what the moisture content and how the water flows to the soils. We also have physical topography, the slope, the aspect, the elevation. All of these things really define what kind of trees are going to grow somewhere. These things are really fairly easy to observe. They're right there in front of you, as opposed to climate and the natural processes. So we can look at the bedrock, the superficial deposits, the soil, the hydrology. We can measure that. We can determine on the slope what the slope is, the aspect, the elevation. These things are things that we can measure and measure easily. So this is another one of those slides that sort of is a little confusing, but it gives you a good idea of what kind of a tree. If we pick one out, we'll just go, if you can follow down a few, we'll go to our tree, our Vermont tree, sugar maple. Sugar maple is a Goldilocks tree. It needs a high amount of moisture, but not too much moisture. It needs a very high amount of nutrients. It needs a moderate soil temperature and moderate light. It can grow in low light. But so these are the requirements that tree would have. This slide shows the requirements of a number of different species. Bedrock. We have a lot of, we're lucky in Vermont actually, we have our bedrock is a little bit different than our surrounding states. It's different than New Hampshire and New York. New Hampshire soils are more granitic. We have more limestone in Vermont than most of our neighboring states, but we also have schist and shale and slate, a variety of different kinds of bedrock. They have different chemistry, different texture. And so therefore, they actually affect this community distribution. So certain tree species like different kinds of things. Some species like beech can do very well on a granitic soil. Sugar maple really needs to have soils that are more either schist or limestone or have some sort of calcium component to them. Taking a look, we can look at our state. We have good bedrock geology information, and actually even better now than this particular slide shows. But if we look at a bedrock geology map and then look on the ground, we can determine where these types of communities can be found, like red maple tamarack swamps. We'll know where they can be found because we're looking for the very high calcium rich soils. We can find the limestone bluff cedar forest because we know where that shallow to bedrock, very high in calcium soil is, or where that bedrock exists. We know where the acidic outcrops are. So even without knowing what trees are there or being on the ground, we can actually have a pretty good idea of what types of forests will actually be growing there. I've actually had phone calls come in where I've talked to someone about where they're located, and I take a look at their soils map and I say, oh, well, you must have a lot of sugar maple and hardhack near your place. And they'll say, how do you know? And I know because I know their soils. And the soils are the surficial deposits that are often, they're based on the activity of the glacier. You know, all of our northern forest has been impacted by glacial activity, which is different than, say, down in the Smokies or in the southern part of the United States where there really hasn't been glacial activity. But we know that glacial till, that movement of soil, covers almost all of Vermont. But it does, this glacial till will still retain the characteristics of the bedrock from where it came from. That doesn't mean that it's the bedrock below it. Sometimes these soils have been moved long distances. And you can see different kinds of trees growing in places where you didn't expect them because of that. But what really helps us too is knowing our soils. So the superficial geology basically is the soil. As opposed to bedrock geology, the superficial geology is showing what is on top. And we have some pretty good maps that have been developed over the years, particularly in our agricultural areas, and the new technology is getting even better where we can determine our soils from remote, from satellite imagery and from LiDAR imagery, laser imagery. So we can get good information on what our soils are. Again, going to tell us exactly what kind of trees are probably growing there. I also, as a forester, and as a person in your own backyard, maybe it's a little hard for you to take that geology map or that surficial map, but one of the things you can do is start becoming a botanist and start learning your indicator plants. Learn the plants that are telling you what that soil is. I will often talk to sugar makers, and people are looking for looking to develop a sugar bush, and I don't even have to look at the trees that are growing there. All I have to do is look at the plants below the trees and say whether this is a really good place to produce maple sap. And that would be in those rich soils. So if you can learn to identify some of the herbaceous plants and listing some of those, I'm going to show a few pictures of those in a minute, you can determine that you've got a rich soil condition, and you know the trees that are going to do best there are going to be sugar maple and basswood and ash. There's also indicator plants for acid soils and wet soils, and those wet soil indicators have been very helpful for us when we're managing a forest, so that we know to stay out of them. So if you don't want to put your machinery in a place where there's a lot of sensitive fern, for example, or false hellebore, because you know that's a wet area, and you're just going to make a mess with the machine, and it's not going to do any good for your forest, and you could be damaging some habitat or rare plants. So you really want to stay out of those wet soils, and if you can see those by some very common plants and know that it's a wet place, then you can make some decisions. So I guess I just take a quick pause right now and see if I've been kind of going fast and I'm talking about a lot of things. So before we take a look at these pictures I got of some rich site indicators, are there any questions at this point?
Thanks, Nancy. And just for folks out there, just a reminder to go ahead and submit your questions using the question function on the box. Just take a quick pause and see if any questions have been Okay, well, we can continue, and please do stop and raise your hand or send in a question and Kate can stop me and I can address it. If I don't get to a question that you might have in this presentation, we can talk about that at the end as well. But anytime throughout here, if you have a question, please feel free to interject. But let's take a quick look at some pictures of some rich site indicator plants, because these are some of the most fun. They're the ephemeral plants often that come out in the spring, and you can start learning to be a botanist by getting to know some of these. The first and one of the most easiest are the wild leeks, or ramps, another name for them. So if you're walking around in your forest and you can smell onion, well, you're probably walking over a wild leek. And this wild leek is telling me that those forest soils are very rich in nutrients. So if you have this plant in your forest, then you have a very rich forest, which will probably be a northern hardwood type. Another indicator plant is this blue cohosh. That blueberry-like fruit will be persistent even into the winter, so you can see a dry, kind of leafless stem holding on to that blueberry above the snow, and it's quite beautiful. Maidenhair fern, oh, who couldn't love a maidenhair fern? They're one of the most beautiful plants that we have, in my opinion, and very distinctive, very difficult to confuse with any other plant out there. So you know if you've got a plant like this and you've got a really rich, nice northern hardwood. And wild ginger is another plant that is an indicator of good, sweet soils. Hydrology, it's important to know that how water is distributed in order to manage the forest, and what kind of trees are going to be growing there as well. So the availability, the abundance, and it determines which communities grow there. Where they're located, upland versus wetland. So now we're looking at a few wetland communities, and down below a dry hydrology, very dry community. So we're looking at three different kinds of things. The first one is a beaver impoundment. The other is an alder swale, very wide floodplain along a slow-moving, meandering river, and then a rich, I'm sorry, not a rich, but a dry rocky site on the bottom. Vermont's climate, as you know, we have long, snowy winters, and we hope that's going to stay that way. Our summers are shorter. We definitely have a lot of precipitation in the state. It's good growing conditions. Winds are generally from the west.
and south, and it certainly is changeable in Vermont. Of course, climate affects range of plants. These are two examples, red maple and sugar maple. Red maple is much more diverse in terms of where it can grow and what its range is. And sugar maple is, like I said before, more of a Goldilocks tree and is more restricted in its climate and distribution. And that's going to actually affect us more with climate. When climate change changes things to a different temperature, our ranges will, for sugar maple, may shrink. Red maple will still probably do pretty well. This is a good example of our average precipitation in the valley. In the Champlain Valley, this is where we get the lowest rainfall, and at the very top of the Green Mountains is where we get the highest rainfall. We do break our state into biophysical regions. So when I talked about the Champlain Valley, that really is in the lowlands next to Lake Champlain. There's the northern and southern Green Mountains. And each of these biophysical regions of Vermont are quite distinctive in the plant communities, the soils, and the site conditions. Slope aspect and elevation mean a lot. You know, in north aspect, you may find hemlock. On a west aspect, you may find more oak or beech. And in rocky slopes, you're going to get more of a community of reptiles growing on those west and south, or living in those west and south slopes with talus conditions that are shown here. So trees it'll depend on what side of the mountain it is what kind of species may be there. Elevation does make a difference too. We're lucky in Vermont that we have a wide diversity of our topography, both in elevation and aspect. We have lots of hills and valleys and mountains and river systems that make a wide diversity of ecosystems, so that we have an opportunity to find refugia over time as climate change affects us. So because we have these really great soils here, and we also have a dramatic topographic difference, we do have an ability to maintain and manage the species composition that are here and protect what we have. This is just an example of a couple different kinds of substrates where things grow. We've got this river system and the floodplain forest, and then we have a rocky alpine community. We have both of these in Vermont. We go all the way to the alpine, down to the valley. Slope makes a difference, depends how steep it is. That depends on the drainage too. You have a very steep slope, it's going to be very well drained, and soil movement will have been more dramatic, so you don't have deep soils. They're very, very shallow soils on steep ground. This is an example of the trees that can kind of grow here. You're going to, poor sites and dry soils are often found at the tops of mountains, on ridge tops, and where soils are very sandy. Your average sites are sort of mid-slope, and then wherever for soil movement or nutrient movement can move into a low kind of concave area, you're going to get some of those really rich sites. There's a pretty good example of Vermont and its diversity of aspects, slope, and elevation. So we've got this is why we've got such a diversity of species here. We also have, stand disturbance. Disturbance is what makes the forest look like it does. Our forests have been dominated by small wind events for the last 10,000 years. This is what the northern forest, how the northern forest has developed. We don't typically have stand replacing events like hurricanes. That happens maybe once every 1,000 years or so, but we have small wind events that happen quite frequently on our landscape, creating these small kind of gaps in our forest instead of very large stand replacing. So these major windstorms are not common, but minor windstorms are. We have ice events, and those ice events are happening more commonly now with the bit of changing climate. One of the worst that occurred in Vermont in our recorded history was in 1998, and we learned a lot from that ice storm. Fire is not a big player in Vermont. Mainly, we kind of think of ourselves as the asbestos forest because we typically have high humidity and a moist environment. So we really haven't had a lot of historic fires except at the tops, on ridge tops, and in some of the sandy soils, the outwash soils. Flooding, we definitely get a lot of that along our major rivers, and that drives the type of forest that is there. Insect and disease always cause some aspect of mortality, and sometimes large areas of mortality. And of course, human disturbance. We cleared our forest, and by the 1850s, we only had 20% of Vermont was covered in forest. While today, we're back, we've recovered from that. Pre-colonial, we were probably up at 90%. We're now at about 77% forest cover across our landscape. But for the first time since our forests have been recovering from our early clear cuts, we are now losing our forested development. Oh, okay, just moving on, when we do have a disturbance, what happens? What occurs when we make a change, when either nature makes a change or we make a change? We typically, what happens is succession, and succession is based on tolerance, which is what I described earlier. When a tree has a tolerance to shade or needs to have full sunlight, really it depends on what's going to grow there. So I'm going to go quickly through what succession is. We know that it's a constant process. It doesn't just happen once and then goes through a very simple kind of process like I showed you, starting from an old field to a grassy field to some early successional species. Now we're in the middle slide, we get to a sort of teenage style forest. That's really what we would call the stem exclusion, where all the trees are the same age and starting to die because of competition. Then as time goes on, you start developing that uneven age condition, and finally that's what you have trees of all different sizes. Now that's really a straightforward linear line. It doesn't really happen that way. Things just come, there's more disturbance, things get moved forward, moved backwards, and for forest management, we often think of managing our forest as mimicking nature and either speeding up or slowing down what nature would do on its own. Oh, fair, this is the last one. All right, but so it goes from this regeneration stage, sapling stage, pole timber, saw timber, to where you start getting more disturbance. When a tree in the forest reaches about 100 years old, then you start really getting small disturbances, which creates that diversity in the forest. And if a forest has a dominant number of trees that are 150 years old, as well as dead trees and downwoody material and gaps in the forest, then you can call what you have as a truly old forest. Ecology informs management, as I've been talking the whole way through. We're going to integrate our knowledge of ecology, including site conditions, the requirements of the tree species, and what natural processes are. We want to mimic what nature does to grow our trees. And only when we can really understand the landscape ecology can we really make good decisions when we're managing our forest. And that's basically the end of my presentation. There's two quotes here from two very different people. Gifford Pinchot was the first forester in the United States under the Teddy Roosevelt administration, and he was really about managing the forest for utilitarian needs. That forestry is the art, but he was also very cautious about doing it well. So forestry is the art of handling the forest so that it will render whatever service is required of it without being impoverished or destroyed. And so if we take that look at whatever the service is, and the service could be ecosystem services, it could be privacy, it could be the sacred nature of being in the forest. Those are all uses depending on what it is that your goals are. And it also includes water quality, air quality, timber, the trees that we use to build our houses. So all of this, when you take it in the broad context, makes a lot of sense. And today, one of our greatest scientists of the day, the crucial factor in the life and death of a species is the amount of suitable habitat left to them. So it's critical for us to make sure that we protect what we have, keep it whole, keep it connected, so that we have something to leave for future generations where we can talk more about what we do with our forests. Thanks a lot for listening. I do hope there's some folks out there that might have a question or two if we have time. Sure. Should I go back to the slide? Would that make sense? Or no? Sure. I can certainly talk about that. So one of the things that we've learned in science is that when you create a island of forest, which means it's fragmented either by, particularly by roads, but roads and development, power lines, things that we do from a human perspective that breaks the forest cover so that there limits movement. That creates a situation where species can't wildlife species have difficulty moving from one area to another, so their genetic the population and their genetics will diminish over time. So we want to be able to maintain that integrity of the forest by allowing that wildlife movement. That actually stays the same for plant movement too. Although plants don't move the same way that animals do, they still do need that connectivity in order for the seed source to move and get to another place and stay whole and connected. So that connectivity that we talk about is keeping those large forest blocks where wildlife populations can have room enough to breed and have a population. For example, a black bear would need something like 25,000 acres to have a breeding population. Bring that down to a smaller species like a mole salamander, they're really restricted to their vernal pool. But if that vernal pool dries up, they need some place to go. So there needs to be an opportunity for them to move across the landscape to get to another suitable habitat. So in order for us to keep our forest intact and whole with all the species that exist now, is to allow that ability for those animals to move across the landscape and meet up with other populations to keep the genetic diversity healthy. I hope that answered the question. Yes, and then I don't have the mapping. That there is really good mapping though at the Agency of Natural Resources that can show specifically where you are located and what you're looking at. But there are certainly large blocks of forest in Washington County that are being fragmented for different reasons. So it is a statewide issue, and we have identified all of our very important blocks and our connectivity blocks and as well. And you can get involved too by being part of regional planning, your town planning, particularly looking at town planning and where your forests are and how you keep those forests intact and connected to other places. Hedgerows are really good places for animals to move back and forth. So even if we keep our riparian areas, our streams and rivers with our riparian areas intact, where there's animal movement across a more open landscape to get from one block of forest to another. It is a statewide issue, and actually it's a northern forest issue. Alberta pools are very sensitive. We like to think about keeping a life zone of about 600 feet from the center of from the edge of the vernal pool. That's the area where the animals spend most of their life. The mole salamanders, which live to be about 20 or 25 years old, will always go back to the same pool that they bred in the first time. So that animal will go in someplace underneath a dead tree that's fallen to the ground, and that's why they're called mole salamanders. They actually bury themselves underneath these big chunks of dead wood, and they stay there most of the year and then come back to the pool to breed. If a pool has been altered either by draining it, driving through it, or even altering the hydrology around it by having roads too close to it, that can create that a sink for that animal that's trying to breed, may be erroneously breeding in a skitter rut and therefore failing. Climate change is actually a problem that we're looking at that could be an issue with vernal pool. Smaller vernal pools drying up because of lack of snow depth in the winter, not as much water, and then in earlier summer droughts, drying those up. Most salamanders need to have eggs to mature and become adults. They need to come through about July. The pool has to stay wet. So there's really a lot. They're very sensitive places. 100-foot no-cut buffer is recommended with a 600-foot minimal cut, and staying out of those areas with big machinery. No, it's not unusual, and sometimes there's areas where there's a variation in hydrology. So if there's a variation in the hydrology, you may have a kind of an overlap. So our forests never have areas that are a defined, this is this type and this is this type, or very rarely does that happen because there are differing conditions. A perfect example is a red maple tamarack swamp. So there's a conifer and a broadleaf tree growing in the same place that happens to be in a place where there's a high calcium content. That's an actual natural community. But also we have instances where past history has defined what trees are growing there. So you may have a hemlock growing in a hardwood swamp that's up on a bit of a hummock, or you may have remnants of another component that has been harvested and now is primarily red maple. We are also losing our ash trees, so our red maple ash swamps may turn into just red maple swamps. So there is variation, and that variation of soil hydrology and nutrients will help define what kind of species are there. If in there, if you have a question or would like to have more information about your own particular backyard, you can always call the county foresters. So I'm available in Franklin and Grand Isle, but we have county foresters in every county in the state, and we are available to come onto your property, take a walk, look around, and help you out. Thank you.